Back in the winter of 1883, out where the sky was wider than most dreams and the land still breathed wild and free, there came a letter in a girl's trembling hands. A letter from a man she'd never met, promising a new life, a homestead, and love. Clara was a seamstress from Illinois, gentle-hearted with laugh lines blooming early from too much smiling. Some called her sturdy. Some said she had a generous figure. But Clara had a spirit bigger than most men could hold. She wasn't delicate like a prairie flower. She was a blooming sunflower, tall, golden, and unashamed. Now Clara had read all his letters twice over. Jedediah Turner, a rancher from Dry Creek, Wyoming, said he wanted a woman to share his land, cook by his fire, help raise children, and grow old with. His words were kind. He didn't say much about looks. Clara liked that. Made her feel maybe she was enough. So, with hope stitched into every corner of her heart, Clara sold everything she had. Her little sewing table, her mama's dishes, even the lace curtains she'd hemmed by hand. She packed her mama's quilt, her sewing kit, and what was left of her life into a single trunk. And she boarded a train west, through the heart of winter, with nothing but a name, a promise, and a heart full of stars. The train hissed and groaned as it pulled away from Dry Creek's weathered little platform, leaving Clara alone in the swirling snow. She stood there, her trunk by her side, breath misting in the winter air. She smoothed her skirt and clutched her shawl tighter, eyes scanning the empty street. She waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. A man led his horse down the road and tipped his hat politely, but kept walking. A group of boys tossed snowballs near the livery. The wind picked up. Still, she waited. Finally, through the curtain of snowfall, a figure appeared, broad-shouldered, wearing a dusted brown coat and a hat pulled low. Jedediah Turner. He didn't smile, didn't greet her with warmth or take her hand like a man greeting his bride. He walked up slow, nodded once. "Miss Jenkins," he said, lifting her trunk onto the back of his wagon without looking her in the eye. Clara's heart sank. Later, behind the barn at his homestead, he finally spoke the words she hadn't wanted to hear. "You're not what I expected." She turned toward him, heart pounding. "Oh?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. "You're a fine woman, I can tell. But I was thinking, someone a little smaller, more delicate." The words fell like stones. Clara blinked, her throat tightening. She nodded once, quietly, carefully, like her heart might crack if she moved too fast. "I see." She didn't argue, didn't plead. She just turned and walked away, boots crunching in the snow, her shawl whipping behind her in the wind. She didn't know where else to go. She wandered back toward the train station, not because she had a plan, but because her legs needed somewhere to carry her, and the station was all she knew. The snow was falling harder now. Clara stared at the empty tracks. She didn't have a return ticket, didn't have a room, didn't know a soul in this town. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Not loud, not wild, just steady. Quiet grief. A slow unraveling. She didn't even try to wipe them away. She sat there in the silence, snow clinging to her lashes, unsure of what to do, or where to go next. Only when her fingers had gone numb and her legs stiff with cold did she finally rise, not because she had direction, but because sitting in the cold wasn't living. She picked up her trunk, turned her back to the empty tracks, and began walking into Dry Creek, into the unknown. Dry Creek wasn't much more than a cluster of wooden buildings, a few muddy streets, and a scattering of townsfolk with faces hardened by wind and winter. Clara walked through it like a ghost, shawl damp, trunk heavy, boots soaked through with slush. She didn't know where she was headed. All she knew was she couldn't stand still. At the far edge of town, she found a room for rent above the apothecary. It was small and drafty, with a slanted roof and a single bed barely big enough to stretch in. But it was dry, and for now, it was hers. She paid for the first 2 weeks with the last of her sewing money. Then, slowly, she began to stitch a life back together, thread by thread. She offered mending to the townsfolk, split seams, worn hems, patches for the boys who tore their pants sliding on frozen hills. She baked a few pies and offered them to the cafe in exchange for eggs and flour. She asked no favors, told no tales. But still, the whispers came. That's the mail-order bride who got turned away. Poor thing. Shame about her figure. Did you hear she waited in the snow for hours? Clara kept her chin up, lips pressed like stitches. She'd heard worse. And besides, she wasn't made to bend for anyone. Each morning she tied her apron, walked through town with her shoulders back, and proved that being rejected didn't mean being ruined. She made quiet friends. Mrs. Pickens at the bakery offered her day-old bread in trade for sugar stitching. The blacksmith's wife brought over a bolt of faded gingham and whispered, "It's good to have another woman who understands how to keep things together." But it was the general store where Clara began to feel something stir again, something she thought she'd left behind on that snow-covered platform. The general store in Dry Creek sold everything from nails to ribbons to licorice sticks in a glass jar. It was the heart of the town, always full of chatter and clinking coin, but at mid-morning it quieted. That's when Clara preferred to go. She'd come in for thread or flour, always with her basket on her arm. And that's when she began to notice him. Eli Cartwright. He worked behind the counter, tall, soft-spoken, with spectacles perched on his nose, and a way of moving that said he didn't care much for crowds. He wasn't flashy or loud, like the younger men who hung around the saloon. He was still. One day, as Clara paid for a spool of green thread, Eli glanced at the book peeking from her basket. "You like to read?" he asked, his voice quiet but kind. Clara nodded, a little surprised. "Romances mostly," she said. "Lately I've needed happy endings." He smiled. Not a smirk, but a soft, knowing smile. "I might have one or two books tucked in the back that you'd enjoy." And that was how it started. The next time she came in, a slim novel wrapped in brown paper was waiting by the register. "No charge," Eli said, eyes down. "Just return it when you're done." She did. And when she brought it back, they spoke for longer. About the characters, the writing, then about weather, pie crusts, prairie grass, and the way time feels different in the winter. Week by week, the conversations grew. Never too long, never too forward. But something began to stretch between them, warm and slow, like sunlight melting ice. He never mentioned Jedediah, never brought up the gossip that swirled around Clara like dust. He just looked at her like she wasn't some poor story he'd overheard, but a book he was still reading, curious, intrigued, and willing to wait for the next page. As the weeks drifted on and the snow softened into slush, Clara began stopping by the general store, even when she didn't truly need anything. Sometimes she'd ask for buttons, other times, molasses or fabric scraps. But always, she'd linger just a little longer near the counter. And always, Eli was there. He began setting books aside just for her, tales with brave-hearted women and slow-growing love. She'd return each one, neatly wrapped, sometimes with a fresh pie or a pouch of her hand-stitched tea sachets tucked into the basket. He never asked for anything in return. But every time she walked through the door, he stood a little taller, smiled a little softer. One chilly morning, Clara brought him a tart with a ribbon tied around the tin. "It's cranberry," she said, setting it gently on the counter. Eli blinked, touched but unsure. "This is too kind," Clara smiled. "Kindness isn't meant to be measured, Mr. Cartwright." He looked at her then, not quickly, not shyly, just looked, like he was reading her again, and this time, understanding the meaning between the lines. Their talks grew deeper, though never too long. He asked if she missed home. She asked about his late wife, and he spoke gently, without pain. One afternoon, as she turned to leave, he called out softly, "Clara?" She paused. "Place feels different when you're here." She didn't know what to say, so she simply smiled and held the warmth of his words like a secret under her shawl all the way home. Spring began to tease the edges of Dry Creek. Snow melted into rivulets along the dirt roads, and windows opened just enough to let the air in. And in her small upstairs room above the apothecary, Clara worked on something quietly, night after night. Her mother's old quilt had traveled 1,000 miles with her, worn, familiar, stitched with the lives of women who came before her. But now, Clara was adding new pieces, bits of gingham from the bakery apron, a patch from her own shawl, a sliver of fabric that matched the ribbon Eli had once admired. Every square was a memory. When the quilt was finished, she folded it carefully, wrapped it in brown paper, and carried it through town with hands that trembled only a little. The bell above the general store door chimed as she stepped inside. Eli looked up. "Miss Jenkins." "I have something for you," she said, placing the bundle on the counter. He untied the twine gently, unfolding the quilt layer by layer. His fingers moved slowly across the stitching, pausing over the worn edges and new patterns. "You made this?" Clara nodded. "It was my mama's, but I added to it. Thought maybe it could keep your chair warm." He looked at her, really looked. His voice was quiet. "No one's ever given me something like this." She smiled softly. "Well, no one's ever made me feel safe enough to." Eli stepped around the counter. He didn't rush. He simply took her hand, rough fingers, gentle grip, and said the one thing that reached deeper than she was ready for. "You are the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." The air left her lungs. Not because she didn't believe him, but because, for the first time, she finally did. The town's spring harvest dance was the kind of event that brought everyone out, even those who claimed they were too tired or too old. The schoolhouse was strung with lanterns, and the fiddler tuned up just as the sun began to dip behind the hills. Clara arrived alone, wearing a dress she'd made just for the occasion, soft lilac with cream buttons. Her hair was pinned, her lips touched with rose-petal balm. She hadn't come to dance. She told herself she only wanted to watch the children twirl and the couples laugh, to feel part of something just for an evening. But Eli had other plans. He stood near the punch table, in a freshly ironed shirt and his usual quiet demeanor. His eyes found Clara the moment she stepped inside, and then he walked toward her, not quickly, not nervously, just like he'd decided. "Miss Jenkins," he said, bowing slightly, "would you dance with me?" Clara looked around, at the people who'd whispered, who'd watched her walk through snow and sorrow with her head high. "Are you sure?" she asked gently. Eli smiled. "Very sure." She placed her hand in his, and the warmth there nearly undid her. They stepped onto the floor as the fiddler began a slow waltz, and the room seemed to quiet around them. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. They moved together, his hand on her waist, hers on his shoulder, eyes locked, heart steady. And for a moment, Clara forgot everything. Jedediah, the whispers, the frozen platform. All that remained was the steady rhythm of this man who saw her like no one ever had. Later, under the stars outside the schoolhouse, Eli turned to her. "I never expected to find love here," he said. "But then you walked into the store, and it was like everything I thought I'd lost came back." Clara's throat tightened. "And you," she whispered, "you didn't just look at me. You saw me." He stepped closer. "I've been seeing you, Clara, every day since the first." And when he kissed her, it wasn't rushed or unsure. It was the kind of kiss that says, "I'm here, I'm yours, and I've been waiting for you." A year later, under a sky that held the promise of summer, Clara stood beneath a blooming dogwood tree, dressed in cream lace she'd sewn by hand. The breeze played with the hem of her gown, and the scent of fresh earth and wildflowers lingered in the air. Beside her stood Eli. His hands were a little shaky, but his eyes, oh, his eyes, held steady on hers like she was the only thing he'd ever searched for and finally found. They were married on the hill behind the general store, where the prairie stretched wide and soft, and every guest could feel something sacred in the air. Their vows were simple, spoken gently beneath the trees. And when Eli said, "I never knew peace until I met you," Clara's hand didn't tremble in his. Later, they danced in the grass outside the store, where it had all begun. Two people who had weathered their own storms and still found the sun. Eli leaned in, resting his forehead to hers. "You changed my life," he whispered. She smiled. "No, you just reminded me who I already was. So if you ever feel like life has left you behind, if the world tells you you're too much or not enough, remember Clara Mae Jenkins." She rode west with hope in her chest and was met with cold eyes and colder silence.